Hello and welcome to this India Today special. India, it would seem, has been the flavor of the season in the backdrop of the G20 summit. But are we truly a rising economic power as is being projected? Or are there many mountains left to climb? Joining us now is someone who has a ringside view from a global perspective to what's happening in India and the world. I'm joined by Dr. K. Subaramaniya, the Executive Director of the IMF for India, as well as the former Chief Economic Advisor. Appreciate your joining us, Dr. Subaramaniam. Good to have you here in India.
My pleasure, Rajdeep.
The G20 summit has created a lot of buzz around rising India. The fact that we've emerged from the 10th largest economy in the world to the 5th, and the hope that we will reach 3rd in a few years. How much of that hype do you believe is deserved? And how much does it conceal certain other concerns in your view?
Rajdeep, you would recall the interview that we had just after the first quarter of 2020. At that time, I had said that there's going to be not only a V-shaped recovery after the pandemic-induced lockdown, that the economic growth in India will be very, very good. So it is not just that we required a G20 to basically tell the world that India is rising. India's growth, if you look at 7.2% last year, and when the revised numbers will come in, it is my estimation that the growth will be closer to 7.5%. With the first quarter growth being 7.8%, India has been, doing really well, and the G20, in particular, really signals the stature that India has now come to command in the world, in the Committee of Nations. When you look at the fact that a unanimous declaration was signed, a very seminal proposal, and something that everybody agreed to, which is the corridor, the infrastructure corridor, which I have called it the new Silk Route, together with the India displaying leadership on financial inclusion, on the public digital infrastructure, and also on cryptocurrency. I think these are very, very important moves, clearly. So any doubts that people like you would have had should have been settled by now.
But I must still raise, my job is to raise the question, so I will continue to raise the question. Two doubts that emerge from what you just said. One, when you cite GDP numbers, the fact is those numbers also conceal possibly the reality that we've emerged from a low base. There are economists who say that if you discount the fact that we've emerged from a low base during the COVID years, go back to 2019-20, we are still at an average of 3.5 growth rate, which is a low to middling growth rate. So how much is that 7% plus conceal the fact that we are emerging from a very low base in the COVID years?
So, there are a few problems with this, Rajdeep. Firstly, and I'm sure you would have seen, I had written a piece in the Times of India where I had shown the growth not only for India but for the top 10 countries over a 3-year period, taking into account the base effect, taking into account the fact that during the pandemic year, every country, not only India, had a growth decline, and shown that India had the largest growth during this 3-year period over the top 10 economies. Point number one. Second point, I think you would you'd remember very well when we had made the prediction about the V-shaped recovery, people who basically didn't even believe it at that point in time. So if they are talking about now the base effect, and having at that time not believed that there will indeed be the base effect coming about because of the V-shaped recovery, I think you can't have it both ways.
Even the word V. Even the word V generates controversy. There are those who suggest it's more like K-shaped. There are certain areas where we've grown, other areas where we have not. I mean, indigenous manufacturing still hasn't perhaps picked up to the extent that one would like it to. Yeah. There are still question marks over certain sectors. So therefore, are you willing to concede that maybe rather than being gung-ho over a V-shaped recovery, it's a more gradual K-shaped recovery?
No, so actually, and I've said this before, Rajdeep, and I think it's important to repeat this, that this argument or this claim that the recovery is K-shaped is disingenuous, and I'll tell you why. Because even in any year, the best years or in a crisis year, growth across sectors is never uniform. Like the five fingers in a hand, they're actually of different sizes. If you take any year, it's not as if manufacturing, services and agriculture grow at the same rate. So, this is something that's an intrinsic feature of an economy always. So, just to then say that for the particular time of the pandemic, growth rates are different and therefore it's a K-shaped recovery, I think makes it very, very clear that the argument is disingenuous. Now, if you look at even specifically the crisis period, take the previous crisis, for instance, the global financial crisis. During that time, it was actually manufacturing, that did well. Services did not do as much. In fact, actually, it was the other way around. Now, that is also, people could have called that a K-shaped recovery or whatever it was. So my point here is that it is not a characteristic of just the COVID period. Any year you pick up, you show me a particular year, not only for India or any other economy, where every sector has grown at the same rate, I will then stop calling myself an economist.
Because the fact is that when you throw numbers at us, particularly the GDP numbers, there are those who say those numbers do not give the complete picture of this country, A, because of the low base that I mentioned, B, also because they don't account for the unorganized agriculture sector, unorganized non-agriculture sector, which in a way is the one which has hurt the most in the post-COVID period.
Rajdeep, when I actually give you an argument, you mentioned about the base effect, and I actually told you the data. That over a 3-year period, India, among the large economies, accounting for the base effect, has had the best growth. So please accept that argument and then let's move on. I think that claim is not on very solid ground. I think India indeed has displayed very good, growth out of recovery, out of COVID, because, and here I think it's not an accident that India has had actually such good performance, because we anticipated, unlike any of the other economies, that COVID is going to be a big supply side shock. And the measures that were taken actually were a good balance of both the demand and the supply side measures, which is why in a time where, because the twin crisis, both the COVID and the Ukraine war, you have advanced economies facing between 2.5 to 4 times their historical average inflation. India's inflation has been actually less than its historical average. So not only have we come out with very strong macroeconomic fundamentals, unlike the fragile 5 performance during the global financial crisis, we've also had very strong growth. So I don't think we needed a G20 as actually a proof of the recovery. G20, as I've said, is essentially just signaling the stature that India has now come to command in the global community.
I'll come to the G20 in a moment, but the unorganized non-agriculture sector is the one which is seen to have suffered the most in COVID times, led to unemployment, led to falling incomes. And there aren't signs yet of a complete recovery. Do you believe that will be a more slower recovery? That remains the major challenge going ahead.
So here, if you look at, and there are enough academic studies now. If you look at the paper by Dr. Arvind Panagaria, the former vice chairman of Niti Aayog, he's actually used data showing, the fact that recovery, if you separate by urban versus rural areas, looking at employment as well, recovery has indeed now been complete. If you look at the PLFS data, if you look at employment has already recovered beyond pre-COVID levels. So I think, when you let the data speak, rather than go for particular narratives, I think the claims that you're making are clearly, they do not have any ground.
You mentioned G20 and the fact that the G20 in a sense reflects what you believe is India's emergence as a leading economy. Now there will be those who will say, yes, we are the 5th largest economy in the world, but even among the G20 we have the lowest per capita income. That we are the country with the maximum number of poor. 16.4% of our population remains below the poverty line. The next is South Africa with about 6.4%. These are real concerns again going ahead. Inequalities remains a major concern.
Now, look, here as well, I think let's go by so for a population of 1.4 billion, clearly, when you have a base like that, obviously per capita income in dollar terms, when you compare, actually will be lower. But the right way to compare is always using purchasing power parity, because the dollar, what it can purchase, let's say, in the US versus what it can do in India is different, right? When you use purchasing power parity, India does not look, as as behind in terms of per capita, when you come to look at that. compared to other countries. That's point number one. Second, when you talk about inequality, I think, because of the inclusive nature of growth, especially through the digital infrastructure that India has created. Now we have more than 500 million bank accounts, and each of these bank accounts are being used by the poor. So through the use of the public digital infrastructure, India has been able to really make growth inclusive. And this is being shown, if I refer to the paper by Dr. Arvind Panagaria, where he actually shows that inequality, if anything, has actually declined during the last 3-4 years. Inequality has not gone up, and this is using the PLFS data. Again, so when you look at the data carefully, some of the claims actually, which are sort of narratives that are spun, I think do not have as much.
So you don't accept the fact that income inequalities remains the major challenge going ahead, that for a country like India, as we sort of, project ourselves to the world as this fastest growing economy, that will remain the big challenge. Even when I look income inequalities, and then I come to social sector, which is health and education. If you look at a per capita investment in education, per capita income in health, we are the lowest still among the G20 countries. So critical areas still remain before we can truly claim to be, in a sense, the rising power that we now hope to become one day.
So I think, we have to be very careful here to not keep moving the targets here. First, when you started out, we actually were talking about the macroeconomics. We're talking about growth. I don't think anybody here is going to contend that there is no work to be done. Let's be very clear. When I'm talking about inequality, I'm talking about the change in inequality, because the narrative that a lot of, people, especially those that are sympathetic to your kind of arguments.
Let
me finish. Actually, I'm not talking about you. I'm talking about those economists that are actually sympathetic to your kind of arguments. They basically contended that inequality is rising. I'm not saying inequality in terms of the level is something that we should not be working on. We certainly should be. But what I'm saying, when you look at the data and papers written by very credible people like Dr. Arvind Panagaria, during this 3-year period, inequality has not gone up. That is what I'm saying. I'm not saying inequality is something that we should not be working on.
Because there are papers also written by the likes of Professor Arun Kumar, Professor Malhotra, who have a very different perspective.
Why? Because those are actually based on data that are not reliable, the CMI data. The PLFS data, we know very well, it is created by the, by the NSSO, which is, tasked with the job of, creating data for the country. CMI is private data, which I've said time and again, even when good news comes on employment, I say that is unreliable. So, those papers that you're talking about are actually written with unreliable data. I don't trust the findings that come from there. Now, when it comes to social sector expenditure, I completely agree with you. We have work to do. And in fact, if you would recall, in the 2020-21 economic survey, we wrote a chapter on healthcare showing that we need to increase our spending. We need to do, clearly a lot. I don't think anybody, those of us who actually, really want to speak the truth on the economy, we're not saying that there is no work to be done. And what we are trying to say is that there is this class of, of perennial pessimists who keep moving the targets. When we say, okay, first they said, oh, growth is going to be terrible. There are going to be millions of people dying on the streets in India. When growth happens, they say, oh, what about this? I am trying to say that those of us who actually want to portray the truth on the economy, we want to tell them that actually don't keep moving targets. Let's acknowledge the good work that is done. That doesn't mean that there isn't more work to be done. There's absolutely more work to be done, but there's been absolutely very good work done.
So therefore, when you look at, let's say, the glass half empty theory of the perennial pessimists, as you call them, would you tell them that the real challenge that you also accept is ensuring that expenditure on health and education in particular, providing not just increasing literacy rates, but ensuring that you're able to provide quality education that makes them competitive for the new job market? That's going to be India's biggest challenge going ahead, skilling and ensuring greater investment in health and education.
So, see, here I think, I don't think any economist is going to go and claim that we actually have, done everything that needs to be done on education and healthcare. But let me remind, especially the viewers, that education and healthcare are actually not just the responsibility of the center. They're actually concurrent subjects, number one. Number two, when it comes to education, the solution is not more money, because our teachers, especially those in government, are paid well. And if you look at several papers, people like, Karthik Muralidharan and others have actually written, showing that it is the governance that needs to change, which is primarily a state level subject, number one. So, but again, I'm just saying, who needs to do the work? I'm not saying there isn't work to be done. On healthcare as well, I think while there's been significant improvement, and let me acknowledge, we on a per capita basis during COVID, I think we did really well by coming up with our own vaccine. I shudder to think about actually, let's say, in a different dispensation, the kind of policy paralysis that prevailed earlier, what would have been the situation? If the same COVID pandemic had happened in sort of such kind of dispensation, I think there would have been absolute mayhem. And I think that is important to actually recognize. In the spirit of, recognizing wherever good work has been done, I think we must say that too.
The other challenge, of course, which I briefly mentioned upon, was manufacturing. And since you quoted Arvind Panagriya more than once, his big concern is that the PLI schemes that the government has brought in, that we need to relook at some of them, that we need to ensure that somewhere customs duty hikes need to be reversed. We can't be protectionist in this new world. We're going to have to ensure that trade barriers are lifted. We're going to have to reach out to the world. Do you concede that perhaps that is another major challenge going ahead if we have to really compete with the global economies?
On manufacturing, there is actually a lot of work still to be done. Let me explain, to our viewers, because this is something that's generated debate. Let me, in 1991, and allow me actually to explain this here, please don't interrupt. In 1991, we liberalized the economy. But what we did not do was, really sort of work on those factors of production that manufacturing firms use. For instance, manufacturing firms need power. Manufacturing firms need land. Manufacturing firms need labor. They also need, to transport their what they produce, and their scale needs to be big enough so that their costs can be spread over a large denominator. Each of these are costs that manufacturing firms incur. And our policy has actually, we did not do anything on in these factor markets to actually enable our firms to be competitive. What happens is our manufacturing firms, on each one of these inputs, they face anywhere between 15 to 20% higher costs than global firms. When you add all these up, you basically our firms are looking at almost double the cost. Even the most, creative entrepreneur can possibly reduce his or her costs by 20–30%. But when the cost is actually double, and this is something that actually has been a policy failure, which has been, which this government has tried to address. If you look at the labor reforms, actually the bill has been passed, in Parliament. The economies of scale, actually, we had the problem of dwarfism. Firms actually, growing old but not growing in size, thereby really reaping economies of scale. That has not happened. Had not happened, has now actually been changed, MSME definitions. The infrastructure spending that is happening has been happening in power and has been happening, in roads and railways, so that logistics costs, are taken care of. Now, when you put all this together, nobody has a magic wand. It's not going to happen overnight, but actually the momentum is very much there. If you look at the monthly economic report that the Ministry of Finance has put up, they show very clearly that private investment, that is new private investment into manufacturing, is really actually, is at a 14-year high. So clearly there is, good work that is being done, but there's a lot more work still to be done on manufacturing.
One final contentious issue is the charge of cronyism, the charge that few are benefiting at the many, that many of these infrastructure projects are going to only a handful of businessmen, and the real fear that it appears that many of our dollar millionaires are actually leaving the country, are looking to park their money outside India, whether it's in a Dubai, whether it's in a Singapore, and that should worry you. If all is so well, why is it that so many people are looking at options outside India? And do you really do you believe that the charge of cronyism should be looked at seriously or not?
So you've asked me two questions here. Let me take your second question first, which is about, people leaving, etc. I'll give you an honest assessment here.
And they seem to be fearful of the fact that the laws do not equally apply.
So let me, as I was saying, in terms of people basically wanting to leave the country. Look, I lived in the United States from 2001 to 2010. And now for the last 8 months, I'm living in the United States again. And, I've tweeted about this, and I'm being absolutely honest. When I lived from 2001 to 2010, when I was seeing what is happening in the United States, I would not see something in India that made me say, oh, wow, this is actually much better in India than in the United States. But today, when I live in the United States, there are multiple things, including being able to actually use my phone to pay for something, actually, whether I drink a piece of coconut water or maybe a coffee. I can do that far better in India than actually in the United States, and just one aspect. So I don't know.
Our digital infrastructures are big, public digital infrastructures are big strength. Our fear is the way laws are applied in this country. Unequally applied, laws that are seen to be draconian, fear of punitive action, all of which is driving money out.
So as I said here, if you look at the evidence on this, if you normalize using the correct base, I don't think this phenomenon actually is as bad as you're portraying it to be. I will admit that I've not looked at the data on this particular, so I will not speculate, but I don't trust what you're actually telling me here.
Okay, I'm going by the reports that have come out. In 2023, 6,500 Indian millionaires expected to leave India, according to the Henley Private Wealth Migration Report. These are numbers coming out, but also anecdotally, when you talk to businessmen, there is a fear factor. There is a fear factor that will institutions operate in a equal, effective manner.
See, that's what I mentioned. When you look at raw numbers, right, you have to use a certain base, because just 6,500 in and itself, when you have population growing itself, without a certain normalization of the base, those numbers mean nothing really. You have to be careful in interpreting these numbers. It may be 6,500 actually, but if you go to a time, let's say 20 years back, where the population was very different, the number may have been 5,000 actually, so you can't really interpret that.
Arbitrariness in implementation of laws
that is something which actually state capacity, is an aspect that India has to work on. It's not something that has been a problem just now. It has been a problem always.
Right.
We need to really, work on improving state capacity significantly in the country. That's apart from, as I said, continued work on manufacturing, continued work on, some of the infrastructure, healthcare, education. Also, state capacity is something that requires work. I'm not going to deny that at all. Again, the spirit of what I'm trying to say is actually this, one, not acknowledging what is happening well, and moving the targets all the time. Oh, growth happened, okay, tell me about social expenditure. If I say social expenditure, okay, tell me about something else, about the laws. And that's what, I'm trying to actually,
fair point, Mr. Subaramaniya.
So now let me come to
cronyism?
Cronyism, yeah. So again, here, if you want to talk about cronyism, we could do a 2-hour session, because I've written a lot about this, the economic surveys earlier. Entire slowdown that we had, starting, before 2018-19 was because of the gargantuan amount of crony lending that was done up until 2013. So, again, this is an aspect that actually, we need to really be working on, moving forward. We, remember, are still a 75-year-old democracy. And, institutional checks and balances are evolving. Things are becoming clearly much, much better than what they were 10 years back. I don't think anybody would want to contend that this is something that is completely taken care of. There is still work to be done. But I can tell you, and having been in the North Block, and I speak my mind, I will tell you that, there is not a single instance of, public sector banks basically getting a telephone call and saying lend to X or lend to Y that has happened in the last 9 years. I think that is a step in the right direction, which is certainly not indicative of cronyism.
Therefore, as I conclude, a few days ago, we interviewed one of your colleagues, your Deputy MD, Geeta Gopinath, and she said India will be the world's third largest economy. By 27-28, it will contribute 15% of global growth this year and will be a key driver of economic growth in the years to come. Do you have any reservations, or do you believe that is the way to look at the Indian economy, as a glass half full?
No, I would. So again, you're trying to put words in my mouth that I actually will not agree with. I'm saying that, unlike some of the perennial critics, seem to believe, there's been a lot of good work that's been done. There are people who actually contend that, becoming the third is basically a foregone conclusion. I don't agree with that. Because, and when I say that, I actually say it in a positive way. We will become the third largest economy, but that will be because of the good work that's been done over the last 9 years, not mechanically, which is what some people make it seem like. Because
last 9 years, or the last, or the years since 1991?
we started in 1991, I think, and I give a lot of credit for the Prime Minister, then P.V. Narasimha Rao, for actually doing what he did. And I have written about it, the 1991 was a seminal moment. At the same time, the work that has been done over the last 9 years after the lost decade of 2004 to 2014 is seminal work as well. And
well,
that
we
is
pulled out the maximum number of people out of poverty between 2004-14, what you're calling the lost decade. We made mistakes, blunders, no doubt.
Terrible blunders, blunders, and I actually have mentioned, I think you know it very well, when the tide rises, without doing anything, boats go up. That whatever growth that we had at that time was because the global economy before the global financial crisis was just a rising tide. Without doing any work, with the policy paralysis as well, we got growth. So I don't think we need to claim credit for just what we got lucky about. Okay, when we come to the work that's happened over the last 9 years, that is what has gotten us to the 5th largest economy. Because if you recall the BRICS, that coinage that was done, of that BRICS, there are many countries. If you take Brazil, you look at China, Russia, they are basically not showing the kind of growth that India has shown. So to say that, the 5th was basically something, becoming the 5th largest economy was mechanical, and therefore becoming the 3rd largest economy also is going to be mechanical, as some people who actually one would believe should know that economics are contending, is clearly wrong. We will become the 3rd largest economy, and I have absolutely no doubt about that, because of the good work that we've done over the last 9 years, and hopefully will continue to do.
Dr. Subaramaniam, as always, combative and most educative. So thank you very much for joining us here on India Today.
My pleasure.
That was the IMF Executive Director for India in Washington, D.C., Dr. Subaramaniam, giving us his perspective on the road ahead.